super happy to be here to talk to everybody today about recent work that's been going on in my lab. So as David was introducing me, he did mention work that I had done with Charlie and work on building this large-scale brain model. And I'll mention those by way of context. But what I really want to focus on today is describing kind of a key goal that we have in my lab and our progress towards that goal to this point. So the goal is to propose a unifying quantitative approach to understanding biological cognition. And of course, I think this is shared by many people, most theoretical neuroscientists in general. One of the things that we like to focus on in my lab is scale. So when we have the word cognition in this goal, we want to be able to address all the varieties of behavior that we see in biological systems, ranging from simple ones up to humans, which we often consider the most complex. And in order to do that, I think there are a couple of key desiderata that we have for the kinds of theories that we want to consider. So these include things like we want to be able to integrate the best insights that we get from standard approaches to cognition. So those include things like the symbolic approach, the connectionist approach, and the dynamicist approach. I'll sort of assume that people are familiar with each of these. So I won't go into too much detail, but I think they all have something sort of unique to say about the nature of cognition. And ideally, if we have a theory that is talking about cognition at the biological level, we will have to capture those insights. In order to do that, each of those typically depend on different types of representations or focus on different types of behaviors, which seem to point to different types of representations. And so our theory is going to have to be able to capture those. So it has to capture discrete representations that have structure. So these are, most centrally associated with symbolicism. They have to capture continuous types of representation, which we might use for understanding a variety of sort of physics and the dynamics of the world that we live in. And we want to capture probabilistic representations, which are important for characterizing uncertainty and how adept biological systems are at dealing with uncertainty. And not only do we have to be able to represent things in each of those ways, but we have to perform computations in each of those ways in order to capture the relevant types of behaviors that are best described in those terms. And then last but not least, because we want it to be a biological approach, we want to be able to take those characterizations and implement them in spiking neurons. And ideally, we would like the biological detail to be flexible. And the reason for flexibility here is largely a practical one in some cases. It's because our computers are only so big. If we make each of the neurons really complicated to simulate, then we can only have so many within a fixed computational budget. And if we want lots and lots of neurons, which is often a thing we do want when we're building large scale models, then we have to make the neurons kind of simple, right? But we might be able to go in and make a particular part of the neuron model very complicated, where we've got lots of details in part of our model, but not in others, and so on and so forth. So ideally, we'll be able to address the wide variety of data that we get across neuroscience and psychology by being able to adjust the detail in our model to be able to accommodate that data. So I think this is the overlying goal that we're focused on. And just by way of context, I want to provide some information about work that we have done in the past in my lab over the last 2 decades at this point, that will sort of help explain particularly what we're focused on. So as David was mentioning, some of my early work with Charlie Anderson was proposing something that we call the neural engineering framework. So this was in an old book from MIT Press. And basically this framework lets us give a high-level characterization of a function and then build a spiking neural network that implements that function. And we specify this in terms of 3 principles. So we talk about what neural representation is, how to compute over those representations, and then how to implement any dynamics over those representations using those computations. Now, the type of representation we tend to talk about in this instance are basically vector spaces, but vector spaces are very general, so they can capture all kinds of sort of mathematical objects that you might want to use to talk about biological systems. So, you can have vector fields, which can be captured as a type of vector space and so on. So, they are very general. But in some ways, what we get out of this NEF is you can think of it as a kind of compiler. So given any dynamical system characterization, so we have a vector space, right? This is how we write down dynamical systems. We've got some state space, we've got some kind of input, and we describe how that changes over time with some function. And that function can be linear, nonlinear, what have you. And so, in some ways, we think this is quite a powerful sort of tool to have in our back pocket Because if we can give a description of a behavior in those terms, then we can build a spiking neural network model of it. And we can, do a lot of the things in that last desiderata. So we can change the complexity of the single cells that are implemented. We can change the types of biological detail we care about, the way that we model neurotransmitters and all kinds of things. And having this in our back pocket means that that last desiderata is one that we have a fairly good handle on. And we've got lots of examples of this in past work. Now, of course, this doesn't tell us what biological systems do or what the brain does. What it tells us is if we have a hypothesis about what the brain is doing and we can formulate it as a dynamical system, then we can build a model that will let us test if that sort of version of our understanding does a good job of replicating the type of data that is easy for us to collect from these systems, spike data, timing data, behavioral data, and so on. But yeah, like I said, it tells us maybe how the brain computes such functions, but it doesn't tell us what the brain is computing. And so in order to address the second question in more recent work, we've built a big brain model based on something we call the semantic pointer architecture, which I outlined in my more recent book, which is the one that David mentioned. And it's called How to Build a Brain, precisely because the idea is that it's proposing an architecture which says these are the kinds of computations that we think are going on in mammalian brains, which is the focus of the book. And so using those, or that architecture, we built a really big model called SPAN, Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network. It's still the world's largest functional brain model. The first version was published in Science. The most recent version is bigger. It has about 6 million neurons, 20 billion connections. So this is a really big neural network model by even today's large language model standards. It's not at the scale that they are, but it's getting there. And it has a lot of sort of anatomical and physiological detail in it. So there's many different types of neurotransmitters. The anatomy of the brain is replicated in the model. There's no connections in the model that don't exist in the brain. And the physiology of different parts of the brain are matched and so on. And most critically, right, the reason we call it the world's largest functional brain model is because of the function. So it does lots of different things. So the latest version does 12 different tasks. I've got them listed here for you. The important part is that not only do we have sort of low-level perceptual and motor control types of tasks, but we also have cognitive tasks. So RPM stands for Raven's progressive matrices, which I'll return to later. This is an intelligence test. RVC is rapid variable creation, which is another sort of syntactic processing cognitive type of task. And so, even in this model, we have some sort of early hints about the types of quantitative theory that can let us capture cognitive phenomena. And so I think we can think of these two sort of sets of methods as basically a starting point. So what the neural engineering framework gives us is a set of methods such that if we can get an algebra that provides the right variety of representations that we had in our desiderata, and specifies the sorts of transformations required in order to manipulate that algebra, then we can build a biologically plausible substrate, right? We can use our compiler. What the SPA and SPAN in particular suggests is that the algebras that we're using there can be used to model key aspects of cognition, right? So the particular type of algebra we're using is called a vector symbolic algebra. Sometimes these are called vector symbolic architectures, but they are not architectures, they are algebras. So I'm going to call them VSAs, meaning algebra. And essentially, I'll introduce these in a bit more detail shortly, but these are ways of initially capturing structure in a vector space, right? So we can encode symbolic types of representations into vector spaces, and then we can manipulate them, and that's essentially what SPAN is doing in order to solve some of those high-level cognitive tasks. But there remains some key challenges. So one is that VSAs have typically been used to model discrete types of structures, so ones that are good at capturing symbolic representations. So the question arises, how do we capture continuous representations? So you can think of these as sort of map-like. Like one of the things that mammalian systems do extremely well is navigation. Working in a physical space, which is continuous, has lots of different properties at different points in that space, is able to manipulate and think about those properties, can move between different types of representations of space, egocentric, allocentric, and so on. And those don't seem to be well captured by symbolic types of representations. And then the second is how to handle probabilistic inference. So this is something that we do discuss in the NEF book, but it's not sort of systematic in the way that I think we could demand. And in particular, it doesn't really propose high-level algorithms for doing probabilistic inference. So it would be nice to have an algebra that can help us handle that as well. And of course, probability theory is another algebra. So it would not be surprising if we could do it algebraically. But the question is how, and can we do it in a way that is consistent with how we handle continuous representations and how we handle symbolic representations. Okay, so I've kind of specified already what the type of algebra is that we're interested in here, vector symbolic algebras. And so I want to introduce these to you, at least enough to give you a sense of how we're exploiting them in subsequent work. So there are essentially 4 key operations that we want to identify in order to specify vector symbolic algebra. The first 2 kind of come as a group. So these are binding and bundling. And essentially, you can think of these as 2 operators which are doing something similar. So they're basically taking 2 vectors and combining them in a compressive manner. So they map from an RD space to an RD space. So the size of the vector doesn't change. And in one instance, the result of that mapping is similar to both of the vectors that were going into the mapping. So that's bundling. So you can think of this as superposition, just adding 2 vectors together. The other operator, does the same kind of compressive operation, but the result is dissimilar from either of the 2 vectors that are going into the mapping. And basically having that difference lets you, capture things like slot filler binding versus collection of objects, right? So if we want to, actually, I'll give some examples shortly. So let me wait until they pop up. The other key operation here is similarity. So we need to do something to basically tell when the output of one of these functions is similar or dissimilar from its input. So in this case, you can just think of this as a simple dot product or some other metric like that. And then just as a final note, that really with binding, you have to be able to do unbinding as well, right? So you have to be able to take apart objects after you've bound them together. So there have to be inverses. And the same for bundling. Bundling, if it's superposition, then the inverse is just subtraction. So it's fairly straightforward. But I wanted to make sure that it's clear that essentially if we have 2 bound vectors and then we unbind with one of them, which is the same as binding with the inverse in this instance, then that should give us back the other vector. So there are many options for vector symbolic algebras, and people like to talk about which their favorite one is or which one should be used. So I've listed some of them here: spatter codes, HRs, map, VTB. It's not super critical on the details of each of these, but one particular one we've used a lot and we think is sort of best for capturing what goes on in biological systems because it works in a continuous space. And because the operations are easy to implement, essentially using a neural substrate. So in particular, the bundling that we use is superposition, so just adding vectors together. And the binding we use is circular convolution, which was first proposed by Plate as a binding operator. And he called this type of representation holographic reduced representations, or HRRs. And just to give you sort of an intuitive sense of what the difference between these operators are, so I sort of stated it mathematically, but it's fun to see with pictures sometimes. So in the top left and in the middle on the top, you can see 2 input vectors, x and y. And on the third item on the top row, you can see the sum of those 2 vectors. And if you look at that sum, you can see basically features of each of the input vectors. So you can see kind of the cat's face, and you can see the penguin's chest and some of it, the back of its head, and so on. And so you can tell that if you took a dot product between either of the 2 inputs and that sum, it would be similar to both of those images, right? You can literally just see that they're there in that final image. If we take those same 2 input vectors and we bind them together, then we get what you see on the left of the bottom row. And that looks nothing like either of the 2 input images. But if we take the inverse of that sort of bound object with, if we take the binding of the inverse of the cat with that bound object, then you see something that looks kind of like the penguin in the sense that it has a big dark blob where the penguin's body is, right? So you kind of have to squint to see this, but you can see that it is more similar to the penguin than the cat. And if you do the opposite unbinding, so you unbind the penguin with the bound object, then you can see something where you've got a bright yellow spot where the cat's body is. Right, so you can see that that is more similar to the cat. But this also sort of demonstrates clearly that this is a compressive operation. And when you try to do the inverse, it's not going to be perfect. You're not going to get a perfect reconstruction of the original input vectors. But this does show that those two operations satisfy the bundling and binding as I defined them in the previous slide. Okay, so when we have these in hand, doing things like encoding discrete data structures is fairly intuitive. There's many different ways to do this, but we can just think of this as kind of a slot filler type of representation. So suppose I have an object, and then I've got slots for color and shape. And suppose it's a blue square, then I can buy blue into the color slot and square into the shape slot. And then sum over those, so I can collect those bound pairs. And now I've got a set of features for that object. And if it was a red circle, I could buy in different things in there. And so, this is a nice representation that the particular role that different objects are playing can easily be decoded. And this can be essentially used to encode any type of discrete data structure, all the data structures that we're familiar with from computer science. So you can do, linked lists and graphs and trees and all that kind of fun stuff. And so, if we think about symbolic representation, if we have a rule, like if there's a vowel and on one side of a card, there's an even number on the other side of the card. So this is like the Wason card selection task. Then we might classically write down that vowel implies even. So the order of those objects matters. So the vowel is playing a different role than even. And if you flip them around, it would be a different rule. So we can write this down as a representation in a VSA, where we basically have slots and fillers. We've got a slot for the relation, slot for an antecedent, slot for a consequent, and then we have fillers, which tell us what the relation is and what different things are in that relation. And of course, this means that we can then unbind those things. We can figure out what the antecedent is, which is going to be, we could then process differently than the consequent. And so if we ask that kind of question, right, this is basically saying, how do we extract that information from such a representation? And in this instance, we would take that vector R and bind it with the inverse or the pseudo-inverse of the antecedent role, right? And if we do that, then you can essentially algebraically see what you expect to come out. So because you're binding the inverse of antecedent with all of those items, and this particular operator is distributive, then basically antecedent, inverse, and antecedent cancel to give you an identity. So you have vowel, the vowel vector is there, plus antecedent bound with a bunch of other things. All of those other things are not sort of important to you. They're not vectors that you would recognize, and so you would treat them essentially like noise. So you do need another operation in here, which is something that gets rid of that noise, right? It kind of distinguishes things in your vocabulary or recognized objects from non-recognized objects. And this is called a cleanup memory. It's something that we've spent lots of time showing that you can build biologically plausible ones of and so on. And there are many of these inside Spawn, for instance. But this gives you a sense that, you can encode that kind of representation using this vector symbolic architecture. And then you can do processing, which is very symbol-like processing, right? You can extract objects in a representation. You can tell what role they're playing. So, you have structure represented. So just to show an example of using this in Spawn, we can look back at this Raven's progressive matrice type of example. And so here I'm showing you one of these matrices. And this is a very famous test of fluid intelligence, goes back to 1936. And actually we built a model of the entire test. But in this instance, I'm just showing, and in Spawn, there's just one type of matrix that it solves. But it's really never seen this type of matrix before, right? So it's essentially doing what you would do if I asked you to solve this matrix and tell me what goes in where the question mark is. And you basically, you're looking across this, you're trying to find patterns, and you're trying to use that pattern estimation to predict. So it's kind of like inference to the best explanation. Right, so now we can watch the Spawn model do this. Now Spawn can't move its eye, so we're using these triangles to indicate the start and end of each of those blocks. And in the bottom left, you can sort of see what information is being fed at any moment in time. It's trying to infer, so it's computing what the transformation is that sort of explains the data. And then when it gets to this last point and you give it a question mark, it writes out the answer that it thinks is best to complete the problem, right? And it got the same answer that presumably you would. The representations we're using here are very symbolic. They're basically structure. What is the structure that is in each of those different squares? And then it compares those structures to one another to try to infer the transformation. that gets you from one square to the next, and then it applies that inferred transformation to the last square to give its prediction of the outcome. So this is great. And this is kind of where we were once we published Spawn. So I think it shows that this kind of discrete representation is, useful. We can use vector symbolic architectures to capture key elements of cognition. But we still have those two challenges. So what about representations of continuous space, right? And we know that there are lots of these in the brain. We see all kinds of evidence of them in rodents, which is where we've done lots of work on hippocampus and sort of spatial cognition. So you see things like place cells, grid cells, and so on. So they are able to represent continuous space, and they are able to represent properties at locations in a continuous space. So you might think, well, continuous spaces, that should be the easy part because we are already working with vectors, and vectors are defined, in a Hilbert space, which is a nice continuous space. That's great. But that standard vector space doesn't capture structure over that space, right? So if you think about a map, you've got buildings at locations, and you have different types of buildings at different locations, and buildings might take up a large amount of space or a small amount of space. So the question is how would you capture all of those properties or features as distributed across a continuous space? So in some ways, you can think of this as needing continuous slots, right? So in the previous representations, we kind of define discrete slots, color, shape, and then we fill them. And we can use that to, do all kinds of interesting symbol-like processing. But in the case of a map, it's like we need a slot everywhere, right? So for every spatial location, we need to have a slot. So how might we do something like that? So this brings us to the notion of what we call spatial semantic pointers. So we call them spatial semantic pointers because we call sort of the discrete types of representations semantic pointers. And actually, we call all compressed representations semantic pointers. And this operator is one type of compressive representation, so it's one type of semantic pointer. In this instance, in order to emphasize this sort of continuity, we call them spatial, meaning that they're able to be defined over a continuous space. So in order to do this, we use a method that was actually used in the Raven's progressive matrices. And this is for representing, basically building slots to exist at any originally integer location, right? So in the case of having like 1, 1 in our Raven's progressive matrix or 2 in the cell or 3 in the cell, we could build up a representation of 1 of like the first slot, the second slot, or the third slot by picking a random vector and then binding it with itself, right? So pick a vector, that means 1, bind it with itself, that means 2, bind it with itself again, that means 3, bind it with itself again, that means 4. And you can do this ad infinitum. And that's very useful for capturing things like working memory and so on, and building up any sort of structure with you've got an ordered list. So that is really helpful. And you'll see that I'm kind of abusing notation here. I'm taking the random vector we pick, I'm calling it B, and then I'm putting it to the power of K, but this is a sort of circular convolution power. So it doesn't mean normal power, it means convolving something with itself K times. So this suggests that there is a method for kind of constructing as many slots as you want, but that's defined in discrete space, right? Conveniently, when you are computing the convolution, you can do exactly the same thing that you do with normal convolution. When you're computing the circular convolution, you can go into the Fourier space, and then your convolution becomes a multiplication. And once you do that, then you can actually use sort of exponents, which are fractional, right? So we can always compute a circular convolution in the Fourier space. But if we want to do a fractional convolution, then going to the Fourier space is critical, right? Because then we can move into the Fourier space, we can take that particular component, put it to the power of K, which is just now a well-defined operation, like 3 to the 1.5, and then do that across every term, and then go back into the original space, and now we have a sort of partially sort of rotated, if you will, vector between the original position 1 and the position 2. And so we can do this for any arbitrary K. So once we can do that, now we have basically a way of constructing continuous slots because K is now a continuous value. So what can we do with that? So what we're doing essentially is defining a specific continuous space, and it turns out to be something called a Clifford torus, which in some ways is pretty intuitive for people who have played video games. So essentially, if you think of a flat screen and something goes off one side and comes back onto the other side, or it goes off the top and comes back on the bottom, that is a Clifford torus. So in representing that kind of continuous space, we can now define a point or a slot at any point in that continuous space and then put features there, right, or bind an object to that location. So in order to do that, we can pick two arbitrary, what we call axis vectors, so random vectors x and y in our high dimensional space. So pretend it's a 100-dimensional space. So I have a 100-dimensional x, 100-dimensional y, and then I can pick whatever point I want to represent an object in and put my first axis to the power of x. So let's say for this object, the one that's kind of near 0, 2, I'd put x to the 0, or let's say it's at minus 0.1, put x to the minus 0.1, and then y to the 1.8, and then bind those two things together. And now I have a slot at location minus 0.1, 1.8. And then I can do that for another object, this one over at like 2.5 minus 2. And for each of those slots, I can then bind objects, right? So I can have an object with a bunch of features in it. So it's got 100 features as well. And then I can bind it to the slot I've defined for that object and sum across them. So I have this m vector, think of this like the memory of where these things were. And if I take that m vector, it's in the 100-dimensional space still, right? So that's really the object that we take to be represented in the brain. And what I'm showing on the right-hand side is essentially decoding of that m vector, where we're mapping it into a continuous space. So we're saying, okay, how similar are you to every possible slot over this 2-dimensional space? And when you do that, you can see that the two slots that you defined light up, right? They're the ones that have the most similarity to where those object 1 and 2 would be sitting. So in some ways, you can think of this as kind of an implicit function, right? We've defined this function over this continuous space. And in that function, we can then bind features, sets of features. So to make that even more intuitive, we can just look at an example here where we're answering questions in space, right? So we take on the left-hand side, this is kind of the content of our memory. So we have two foxes at two different locations, and then a dog, a badger, and a bear, and they're all slightly different locations. And then we can start, we can construct that m vector, and then we can start asking questions, right? So we can say, where is the fox? Which would be taking that m vector and binding it with the inverse of fox. And when you do that, then you can see that, what pops out are sort of two locations, right? So the vector that's left over after you do the unbinding tells you that, okay, these are the locations that foxes are in your memory vector. Or if you can say, where is the dog? Then the dog vector pops out, and so on and so forth. And if you ask about something that doesn't exist, then nothing pops out, right? So the last question is, where's the wolf? And you don't get any answer because that feature vector is not represented anywhere in that memory. So now we've got a way of kind of representing things sort of in this vector space and having it define, feature distributions over continuous spaces. And this is just kind of a table of all the kinds of things you can do with that type of representation and how accurately you can do them just in the vector space, so just with the algebra, or when you use the NEF to implement it neurally. And you can see that you don't have particularly significant differences between these numbers. There's a slight drop in accuracy because spikes and so on make that happen. And so the different types of techniques you're doing are querying single objects, querying missing objects, querying locations, querying duplicate objects. You can also query regions. So you can say, is there anything in this part of the space? Instead of just querying particular points. You can move entire groups of objects around, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that gives us a representation of space, but of course, it's not really sort of neurally inspired in any obvious sense. And so we can ask questions like, well, where do things like grid cells and place cells come from? And essentially, in the way I sort of originally defined spatial semantic pointers, is I said we pick an axis vector and we just pick it randomly. But we don't have to pick it randomly. We could pick it with structure. And in particular, if we pick those x and y axis vectors with the right kind of structure, then we can get grid cells extremely easily. And we can go into more discussion about why picking grid cells in particular is good. But suffice it to say that there is some flexibility here where we can sort of use what we know about neural systems in order to inform the way that we're picking or setting up our algebra or algebraic elements. And of course, if we have grid cells, then we can also very easily generate things like place cells. And again, all of this is very easy to do. The pictures that I'm showing at the bottom here are basically doing this with using the neural engineering framework with a bunch of leak integrate and fire neurons In gray is a path that was taken from some rodent data. So then we just stick the path in through all these cells, and then we plot the spikes of each of the cells, and you have these very nice clean grid cells and place cells, of course, because it's a model, right? But nevertheless, it's fully implemented in spiking neurons. And so, we've taken these representations, we've shown that they're good representations, good in all kinds of senses. So for instance, we've compared them to other ways that machine learning people tend to represent continuous spaces. And so here I'm showing results from how SSPs as an input to a neural network trying to compute a policy function compared to using all the other techniques people generally use to try to represent continuous inputs. And you can see that the SSPs do better than all the other methods people tend to use. So random projections, trigonometric functions, random mappings, 2D coordinates, and so on, right? So it's really doing something useful by mapping it into the SSP space before putting it through this neural network. We can also show that, using grid cells as opposed to random, so grid cell axis vectors as opposed to random axis vectors does improve the quality of your representation of place cells, right? And so this is demonstrating that. And this is something that, of course, people expect and have theories about why that's the case. We can also take these representations and put them into, functioning navigation systems. So this is just showing an example where we've got an agent that has path integration, and it's got the ability to recognize objects and learn where objects are sitting over time using cleanup memory. So basically, you're learning the cleanup memory on the fly about what are the objects that are relevant in this particular scenario. And so you can see the path that it takes as it kind of wanders through this environment, and it does this several times. And you can see the environment. And then after it's done this, over several seconds or minutes, actually, in this instance, you can then query it, and you can say, like, where's the blue triangle, right? And then you can see a bright spot where the blue triangle is. You can say, well, where are the blue objects? And so it can tell you where both of the objects are that are blue. You can say where the triangles are, et cetera. You can ask about walls, right? So all of the different features that it's learned as it moved through this environment are now in its memory, and you can query that memory in order to understand where it is. And you can also, of course, use this to locate where it is in that environment. So it has a path integrator, which of course is noisy, but it can also use information about what objects it sees, so where it is with respect to those, to improve its estimate of where its current location is. So this is performing a type of SLAM, self-localization and mapping, in a spiking neural network. All right, so I think that this type of representation, and we have a lot more work along in this direction, but it does argue that we can use that same representation that we had for discrete symbol-like representations for these continuous types of representations that capture things like maps. And I think there's been some really interesting evidence recently. So not only do we see place cells and grid cells and so on in hippocampus, but recent work on looking at how general continuous features are encoded in the brain have found evidence that this grid-like representation might be actually quite common, and not just in hippocampus, but also used for sort of conceptual representations. In the experiments that they did, they were basically taking little animals and changing like the length of the neck or the length of the feet. And in doing analyses of the data, they found this, what was suggestive of a grid-like structure as well. So again, that would mean that something like this algebra could be used for all different types of continuous feature spaces. So the last sort of missing component right now on our desiderata was dealing with probability. So the question is, can we use that same algebra for doing probabilistic representation and probabilistic computations? And so now I want to take just the end of the talk to argue that, yes, this is very feasible and actually has some really interesting advantages over current methods. So I hinted at this when I said, what we've got encoded in this M vector essentially is like a function, right? It's an implicit function over this 2D continuous space. And of course, probability distributions are the same kind of thing, right? They are functions over a space where the height of the function is telling you the probability. So how would we map those functions that we can construct to probabilities in a systematic way? And in fact, it turns out to be, fairly familiar in some senses to techniques that people now use for representing probability distributions when they have a bunch of samples. And the way that you often do this is by basically specifying a kernel And every time you have a sample, you place down that kernel at that sample location, and then you model the density by just summing across all of those samples. So what turns out to be interesting is that the SSPs, these spatial semantic pointers, actually induce a kernel, or what is called a quasi-kernel. It's called quasi because kernels have to be positive everywhere, and the kernel induced by the dot product over spatial semantic pointers is a sinc function, which goes negative. But nevertheless, we can basically take care of that along the way. So because the dot product between these SSPs induces this kernel, we can use this as a way of representing probabilities. And by inducing kernel, basically you can think of that function that comes out is the similarity between, let's say I have one semantic pointer centered at 0. Let's call that my y. And then I sweep my x across every position, and I take the dot product between the SSP encoded at each of those positions, and I plot it on this graph. So that's what we're seeing, is how similar is an SSP at that location to one that is located at 0. And so you end up with this sinc function. So this set of techniques that I just mentioned, where you basically have these kernels and you use them, you sort of sum over them for over all the samples, are called kernel density estimators. And they work as follows. So you have a data set where you've got a bunch of samples, x1 through n. You then have a kernel function of some type. And so that's going to be, the function that you plop down at every one of those locations. You then sum across all of those, and you normalize by the number of sample points and something called the length scale, that h. And essentially, the length scale is just kind of scaling the size of the kernel to the particular space that you're encoding with the samples. So we can see lots of examples of that. People have proposed all different types of kernels. So from left to right, we've got a Gaussian kernel, a top hat kernel, which is just like a square function, Epaneptchanov kernel, which has been argued to be an optimal kernel, an exponential kernel. And you can see that for each of these kernels on the bottom row, you get slightly different error in your estimate of the ideal probability function, which is shown in gray. So, they're not perfect estimators. A lot of them will, with enough samples, become very close, but, you only ever have finite amount of data. So what happens if we use that same technique with SSPs? Then we find estimations that look something like this. So what I'm plotting here is basically in gray, again, the true distribution. In a blue dashed line, which is actually lying under the orange line, you have essentially using a sinc function, so a perfect sinc as a kernel, and estimating the density. And then in the orange line, it's using an SSP to estimate the density, because an SSP, unless you have an infinite number of dimensions, is not exactly equal to a sinc. So it approximates a sinc, and the more dimensions you add, the better that approximation is. Here we have about 2,000 dimensions in our SSP, and you can see that it's close to indistinguishable from an ideal. And then we're also comparing it to a radial basis function KDE, just as to give an example of a standard method. And as I mentioned, this is a quasi-kernel, which is why we're calling it an FIE instead of a KDE. But in order to basically adjust for its lack of being a kernel, there are standard adjustments. So you can compute shifts basically in your function in order to make this a true probability estimate. And it turns out that the shift that you want essentially looks like a rectified linear unit, right? Which again looks like a neural tuning curve. And so this is a very natural and easy thing to implement in a neural network. Okay, so the thing that you really have to compute here is basically the bias B in order to do the correct shift. All right, so essentially SSPs can act as latent probability distributions. The distribution is a bundle of a bunch of symbols, if you will, where those symbols are spatial semantic pointers. We can manipulate those bundles in order to produce probabilistic statements. So just to sort of review, we've got this MD, that's our memory, where we've just summed over all of our data points, where every data point's been embedded as an SSP, and then we sum over all the SSPs. We can then approximate the probability of any point X by taking the dot product between that point X embedded as an SSP and that memory. And so the number that comes out is going to be our estimate of the probability that that data point is in our distribution. We can also do more interesting manipulations. So for instance, we can condition our distribution. So here we've got a two-dimensional probability distribution over X and Y. And we're showing what happens if you condition on Y, right? So for different values of Y, this is I should add axes along the bottom, but basically in the middle, you can see that, things are centered. As you go over to the right, things are shifted to the right. As you go to the left, things are shifted to the left. And that's because you're taking the same distribution and you're conditioning differently. And what I'm showing on the top is the difference between the true mean and the mean that you get from the SSP representation. And as you can see, they're all quite close. And the farther you get to the edge of the domain, the more challenging the estimate becomes. All right, so and there are other manipulations we can do as well. You can do marginalization and so on. But what I want to move to is actually just showing how it can be useful to have these representations and actually do inference over them. So in this instance, the last example I want to talk about is using spatial semantic pointers for Bayesian optimization. So here we've got three difficult optimization problems, and they're all in the class of robotics. On the left, you've got two different robotic arms, a big one and a small one. So the big one takes more energy to move and moves more slowly, but you have different sizes of boxes that they have to reach into. And so you have to figure out which arm to use given the particular box at that moment in time. The second problem in the middle is the belt stretch. So this is two robot arms working together in order to stretch a belt over some pulleys and get it to go on that on the pulleys appropriately. And then the last one is what we call PSR, or permanently shadowed region. And you can think of this as these robots are going into an area where it's, they only have a certain amount of energy. Once they go in the shaded region, they can't gather solar energy anymore, and they're looking for water. And so they want to very carefully choose what's the best place to drill. And when they drill, they get some information about how close they are to water, how likely water is to be in the neighborhood. So they're basically estimating a function in the crater about the likelihood of water being there. And so we can characterize all three of these as reinforcement learning problems. And we can use representations of the states that they're doing the reinforcement over as these spatial semantic pointers. And in particular, we're even doing this in a sort of hybrid manner where we've got agent identities that we're then binding with potential trajectories. So I've kind of got this pictured here in the bottom. So we've got, represented in that sort of implicit function I was talking about, a bunch of possible trajectories, and each trajectory, so in the case of the PSR, is associated with a different robot, right? And so we can identify trajectories with robots. We can then see what those are. We can execute them. We can then get a reward of some kind back from the environment, and then we can use that to update our estimate of the reward function that we're trying to characterize, and then determine how to change our SSP representation in order to, search over that environment in an optimal manner. So that's basically what's going on in the system. And we can see that when we do that, and we compare it to standard methods for doing Bayesian optimization. So there's something called BO-torch, which is just like an off-the-shelf but state-of-the-art method for doing Bayesian optimization. That we can do about as well or sometimes better than standard BO-torch, which is good, right? So the algorithm works, but the critical part here is just how efficient it is. So essentially, our algorithm scales constantly in the number of samples. So however many samples you give me, my SSP vector space doesn't change, right? Because all I do is I take the sample, I project it into the space, I add it into my vector, and that vector never gets longer or shorter. In contrast, standard methods basically add on each new sample to a dictionary of samples, if you will, and then uses all those samples to make an estimate about what the next best thing is to do. So this change in compute complexity has a really significant impact. So, basically using our methods is between 53 and 175 times faster than trying to use this standard optimization methods. And that's what's being captured here in this graph. And critically, I think it's also much more biologically plausible in the sense that we don't have to keep changing the amount of resources that are being applied to a problem, while we can continue to improve our performance on that problem as long as we can incorporate new data. All right, so that's the last example I wanted to provide, because I think it kind of brings us now back full circle in some ways to the idea that maybe the VSAs do provide a useful algebra for cognition. And in particular, combining that with the neural engineering framework to embed them into spiking neural networks, and using something like the semantic pointer architecture to be able to control the flow of information and so on in the ways that it does give us a unifying and quantitative cognitive theory, one which I think I've shown you evidence can do symbolic, connectionist, and dynamicist types of problems. So it kind of addresses each of the strengths of those methods. I've kind of mostly focused on the fact that it can capture discrete, continuous, and probabilistic representations. And then I've showed you examples of the computations that you can do over each of those representations. And then, I've shown you examples as well of how this can be coupled with the neural engineering framework such that you can embed all of this into spiking neural networks. And then, of course, you can compare that to real neural data that you capture in all kinds of interesting ways, which we've done lots of, which I haven't talked too much about in this particular instance. I talked about grid cells and place cells. And then the last thing I want to mention is that, in doing this, I think we've kind of discovered some potentially useful constraints on those algebras, right? So it's not just, any math that you can do with these things is okay. And these constraints are things that, might tell us about how to model cognition more effectively as well. So in particular, the representations that we tend to use are hyperspherical, meaning that they're unit length, and they tend to sit on the surface of a hypersphere in a high-dimensional space, right? So the interior and exterior of the hypersphere are sort of other degrees of freedom, which are typically not super critical for capturing the phenomena that we want to capture. And even more specific than sort of unit vectors, they're often unitary vectors. And what unitary means is that when we go into the frequency space, the length of every frequency component is a unit vector. What that means in the original space is that when we're binding these things with themselves over and over and over and over again, they don't get longer or shorter, right? So being unitary is critical. If you had different lengths of frequency or different frequency components in the Fourier space, then as you did this binding over and over and over again, you'd basically be multiplying numbers over and over and over again. And if those numbers are greater than 1, they explode. If they're less than 1, they decay to 0. So you have to avoid that, right? But this now is interesting because it suggests the types of transformations that are going to be sort of robust to being used in the types of ways that I talked about in the cases that I presented today.